First, I would like to thank Paul Miroka who painted this. It's called On the Wings of Pollinators, and he allowed me to use it for my talk. It actually shows all the groups that have been talked about today, the mammals in form of the bat and that little insectivorous shrew or whatever that is. the birds in form of the hummingbirds. And then the greatest pollinators are of course the insects. I leave the Hymenoptera to Steve. That way the wasps will probably be a little bit neglected because I thought he would do them and he is talking about bees only. The butterflies were Fred's group. Leaves me with the moths, the flies and the beetles. And I will organize it a little bit more from the viewpoint of the plant than going through all the moths and beetles and flies because there's too many. But here I've introduced another plant into this beautiful painting, destroying it a little bit, but it shows I have a pointer, right? It shows the bottlefly here. It shows the flesh fly. Surprisingly, they're all pretty good pollinators. Even some of the ladybugs eat pollen and probably pollinate. And here's a longhorn beetle. Now, there are so many insects on flowers. Why do they go there? We have the ones that feed either on nectar or on pollen. The butterfly, and here's the blister beetle eating the pollen. They don't stop there. They often eat the whole plant. These are buprestids in the genus Achnodera. But everybody who comes to the flower may or may not pollinate. Here is one that is probably not a pollinator. He is there to feed too, but he feeds on other insects. He is an assassin bug. Then there are beetles that come for company, for a mate, to meet their mates, here there are a threesome. They're covered in pollen, but the question is, do they just run around there and get full of pollen, or do they actually make it also to the stigma? I'm not so sure about these. The day-active noctuids, these little moths, sleep in the flowers, hide in the flowers. They eat nectar and they eat nectar, not pollen, but they also leave their eggs there, so their caterpillars will grow up in the flower. Here's another one that comes to oviposit. That's actually a beetle, even though it looks like a wasp. His eggs will stay on the flower. The little larvae will hatch about at the time when the flower is really blooming. It's a desert marigold. And the larvae then will hitch rides on visiting bees, and the bees take them to their nests, and that's where the larvae actually eat pollen and the young bees. So he is a brood parasite waiting for pollinators there. And then the plants also give shelter. This is the inside of a datura plant that are ripped open, and very often I find these scarab beetles in there, and I think they just come for the warmth. These may not be pollinators, but relatives of theirs in the same genus are attracted to a water lily in South America, and that actually produces heat, produces a lot of heat, attracts this beetle, and the beetle is the main pollinator. I hesitate to say for, because it sounds like the plant actively does it. It's all a evolutionary trait that has developed through co-evolution, and it feels so very directed, so I will probably slip into this. The plant does it to attract, but of course it just happens through evolution. So be aware if I slip into that. I don't mean it. So the desert covered in plants, insects visiting them, as I just showed. What makes those flower visitors actually into pollinators? a lot of them have physical traits. Like the bee flies here, a lot of them are very fuzzy. That helps to carry pollen around. Same for the tachinid flies. They are there to eat nectar. The tachinid fly may be also to lay its eggs on other insects, but they may pollinate because they have the right shape. In the first talk we heard somebody said the beetles weren't hairy. Well, a lot of beetles are quite hairy and they do pollinate that way. But it's a quite indirected way of pollination. They just walk over the flower, eat the nectar. They're not collecting pollen. Another trait that good pollinators should have is mobility, then, because the whole point of pollination is the plant cannot move, so the vector or the agent, the insect, has to do the moving for it. That makes the flies that come to flowers and the butterflies good pollinators. The pollinators also have developed physical traits that help them to harvest what the plant offers as attraction. Here is the long brush-shaped tongue of the moth on the left, and here's even a beetle with a long proboscis. That is very rare. The Margarethe is, as far as I know, the only genus that has that. But they're pretty well able to harvest nectar with it. They're also a little bit hairy, so they may be pollinating. There are other insects that are attracted to nectar, like the honeypot ants. They're probably not good pollinators. They don't have any hairs, and they're not as mobile as the others. And here the little carbophilus, they're tiny beetles. Hundreds of them are often in the bottom of cactus flowers, and you see the whole thing moving, the anthers moving, and there are obviously pollen particles on them, but I think they never reach the stigma, so they may not be pollinators. Different so size does matter. Here are the euphorbias. They are about as big as the tip of my index finger. And if they move around and eat pollen, eat nectar, they will eventually end up on the stigma and live there, leave pollen there. They're also mobile enough to cross-pollinate, to fly from flower to flower. And they're even actually quite faithful. They will fly to another cactus flower from there. So they may be among the better ones. For this kind of pollination, Steve had a good word earlier, like mess and...
Oh, yeah, mess, and sometimes it's called mess and soil.
Mess and soil. That's really what this picture should be called. So the strategies for flowers is not just to attract insects, but they want to be cross-pollinated. They don't want their own pollen on their own stigma, and they don't want to be pollinated. If it's a rose, it doesn't want something from a lily. So the main development between a co-evolution between insects and plants is from the side of the plant to keep a pollinator faithful to its own kind. It will use bribes for it, like nectar and extra pollen. Nectar for the strong flyers that need a lot of energy, like bats and hummingbirds and the big moths. The bees take the pollen, and the pollen is mostly high in protein for the ones that use it as nourishment for their larvae. So a lot of plants even produce extra pollen. That's not as, it's infertile pollen, it's not as costly as making the real pollen, but it will still feed the pollen eaters and will be mixed in with the fertile pollen. Then there are some more sinister words here: addiction, deception, and dependency, and we will see how that will go through the story. Here's our datura plant from the desert, and the hawk moth, that its main pollinator. You often see the hawk moths way